Star Wars, The Mandalorian, and The Clone Wars are evidence that Lucasfilm can make Star Wars content that the majority of the Star Wars fan base enjoys. I want to talk about why I think this is and what lessons Lucasfilm could learn from their two crown jewels of content. What's up, everybody? It's Josh. Welcome back to the channel. Use your light side or dark side powers to smash the like button. And let's get right into this video. Now, at the time of recording this video, it is the day before May 4th, 2020. This is May the 4th, Star Wars Day. It's a big freaking deal. If you're watching this on May the 4th, or if you're watching this after May the 4th, either way, I hope you're enjoying the day. I hope that you're taking time to enjoy your favorite piece of Star Wars. We'll be doing a bunch of stuff on the channel. Check our social media and whatnot for that, but either way, just wanted to say happy May the 4th to all of you Star Wars fans, no matter how you feel about the Disney era of Star Wars. And we are getting a sweet little double dose of Star Wars goodness on Disney Plus tomorrow when the final episode of Season 7 of the Clone Wars will air, as well as the first episode in a documentary series all about the making of The Mandalorian. And it struck me how cool this is because Monday or tomorrow we will be getting the Clone Wars finale and Mandalorian stuff, and it's just really apparent to me that both the Clone Wars and Mandalorian are pretty much praised by almost everybody in the Star Wars fan base. There's this thing that goes on out there where people say, oh, the Star Wars fan base is ridiculous. There's no content that Disney could make that would please all of the fans. The Star Wars fan base is the problem, not the content that Disney makes. But the Clone Wars and the Mandalorian fly against that narrative. It's obvious that if the right content would continue to come out for Star Wars, the majority of the fan base would respond very positively to it. Now, this video is not meant to take shots at the sequel trilogy. I want to try to be as positive as possible here, but I think it's very important to note that had the sequel trilogy been of the quality that the content is in The Mandalorian and in the Clone Wars, I do not think we would be in the position we are as a fan base. The Last Jedi turned off a lot of Star Wars fans, and The Rise of Skywalker turned off a lot of Star Wars fans, and I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. I think that's pretty much fact. And it's also important to note that we're not talking about separate or different fan bases here, even though there are different subgroups within the Star Wars fandom. By and large, the same big group of Star Wars fans that majorly positively responded to this final season of the Clone Wars, especially this last arc, and had positively responded to The Mandalorian, is the same group of fans that were turned off by the sequel trilogy. But there's actually a silver lining here, because clearly there are things that were done in The Mandalorian and in the Clone Wars that were not done in the sequel trilogy. And so Lucasfilm could compare and contrast the differences and come up with things that they should really focus on and do a better job of whenever they make the next series of Star Wars movies. So what should Disney and Lucasfilm learn from this conundrum? Why did so many fans positively respond to the Clone Wars final season, especially this final arc, and the first season of The Mandalorian? Well, I think the first and most obvious lesson that they need to learn, and by the way, I think they did learn this lesson, but it all has to do with the fact that the Clone Wars and The Mandalorian are both told with a single story in mind that was created with a single vision for the story. Jon Favreau came up with the idea for the show of The Mandalorian. He came up with the character and he had the arc written. He had an arc for this character and the show written. And of course, there were contributors. Dave Filoni helped him out. I'm sure he got a little help from George Lucas. There were other people that contributed to this story, but it started with a singular vision. And I really want to focus on this because I'm not saying that the vision has to come from a single person. It can come from a group of people, but then it has to be agreed upon, and from there it is a singular vision for the story. It's the same thing with the Clone Wars. That story is told by Dave Filoni. Dave Filoni has the idea of what that story should be, and even though he has contributors that are helping him out, he has other people putting their input into the story, including the different voice actors. By and large, it is a singular vision for the story, and that makes a huge bit of difference. We don't have to linger on this point, but it was so clearly a mistake that the sequel trilogy started off with J.J. Abrams, then allowed Rian Johnson to do totally different things and take the story in different directions, and then bring J.J. Abrams back to go back to his traditional original vision. It's just too disjointed, and I think that's the most obvious thing. And by the way, I do believe that Lucasfilm understands this and they've learned this lesson. They are actively looking for a singular creative vision for their next series of film. Now, the next lesson here I don't think is as obvious, but truly I believe that tragedy and struggle is a vital part of the Star Wars formula for a character's journey. The Mandalorian struggles a lot. I mean, he gets saved a lot from some couple Deus Ex Machina like things with the child and then the Mandalorians coming out to save him, but he struggles a ton. He's beaten, he fails, he's just struggling throughout that series. And at the end of the show, Quail actually dies, which is a tragic element to the story, but also just elevates that story. I think it is so clear that a struggling protagonist is key to what makes Star Wars great. Similarly, if you look at the Clone Wars, it is clear that this last season has been filled with tragedy. Ahsoka is dealing with all sorts of different personal tragedies, and the idea of Order 66 and her feeling that and feeling the betrayal of the clones attacking her, what it means for the galaxy at large, the fact that the Jedi were wrong, the fact that Anakin is screwing up and that Maul was right. These are all tragic elements. They deepen the story. They give it a lot of oomph. And not to mention, when you think about the character of Ahsoka, she fails a lot in the Clone Wars, and it actually endears us to her because we watch her grow and struggle. And I know it's been said many different times in many different ways, raise a Mary Sue. If you don't like that verbiage, you don't like the word Mary Sue, and you want to fight against that, you can't deny that honestly, that character did not struggle nearly enough. And they actually introduced a lot of struggle for the Rey character in The Rise of Skywalker, but unfortunately I think it was just a little too late for some of those beats. If those beats had been kind of spread out throughout the trilogy, I believe we would have been more endeared towards Rey. I often bring this point up talking about Kylo Ren because I think Disney was completely surprised at how many people love Kylo Ren and love the Ben Solo character. But what they don't understand, and hopefully they've learned, is that this is because they actually gave Kylo's character the struggle that they should have given Rey. It was an important ingredient in endearing us to him. Rey simply does not struggle enough. It is really hard to root for her and get behind her actual struggle throughout that trilogy, and I think it's just so clearly an important part to the Star Wars formula, which hopefully Disney can reverse engineer out of these two very successful things that a lot of fans like in the Clone Wars and in The Mandalorian. I think the next lesson that Disney needs to walk away from is just knowing that a very good villain is a key ingredient to a great Star Wars story and something that fans are looking for. If you look at the first season of The Mandalorian, Werner Herzog is an incredible villain. He eats up the scenes. He's so good in those scenes and so villainous and maniacal in the way he sort of twists his words with subtle threats to the Mandalorian and things like that. That was awesome. And then when we get to the end with Moff Gideon and he literally takes out Werner Herzog, Moff Gideon is like a quintessential Star Wars villain. Creepy, knows things that the characters don't know. He's steps ahead of them. Vicious, powerful, calm, cool, and collected. He's a dope villain, and that is a very important part of a Star Wars story formula. Similarly, if you look at the Clone Wars, particularly this last season of the Clone Wars, Maul is so essential to that story. He's incredibly manipulative. He's very powerful in the dark side. He has this bit of knowledge about Sidious that puts him ahead of many of the other characters. It's just so important to have a villain like that. I mean, think about it. Darth Vader, amazing villain, makes the first Star Wars trilogy. Literally, it's so important to have that great villain. When you look at the sequel trilogy, Snoke is sort of a waste of a character. We know so little about him in the first film, then he's sort of discarded and sort of useless in the second movie, and then they bring in Palpatine. And even though I like Palpatine, the way he's used in Rise of Skywalker is actually not that great compared to how he's used in the other movies. He should have been more ahead of everybody, more manipulative, manipulative. He should have held that crazy role that made us all think, holy cow, that's a dope villain. I don't know how they're going to beat this guy. And it just didn't quite get there. I think maybe if Palpatine had been sprinkled throughout, it would have done much better, or if they just would have leaned into Kylo Ren being an actual villain, that would have been much better as well. But they kind of tried to force Anakin's arc and Darth Vader's arc together for Ben Solo's arc, which is compelling and interesting, but ultimately doesn't even make us think of him as a villain. He's too soft, he's too emotional. That's why people love him, right? He's not the reluctant hero, he's the reluctant villain. That's interesting and compelling, but that's not what you want out of the main villain for your story. And lastly, and maybe most important for the Star Wars fan base, which I can admit is a very sensitive lot that really holds their Star Wars at a sacred place. You know, Lucasfilm has, in their better moments, talked about how all of the fans are just passionate, and we appreciate their passion. That's the right answer. The wrong answer is to belittle the fan base, because at the end of the day, even the people that are being kind of toxic online, most of them, that is coming from a good place. They love Star Wars and they are just freaking out and acting irrationally because they feel like that thing they love is being mistreated by a big corporation in Disney. And so to combat that and to take away the lessons from Clone Wars and The Mandalorian, you absolutely must respect and enrich the Star Wars that has come before. I totally get wanting to add new things to Star Wars, including new Force powers and abilities. I totally understand that. I also understand deconstructing the hero status of legacy characters. I totally get that. But the deal is, man, this is a fandom that has been around for 40 plus years. These people are attached to the characters they know and love. And so I think if you detract away from that, if you present Luke Skywalker the way that they did, or they present these new Force powers the way that they did, it doesn't enrich old Star Wars. It brings into questions on whether or not you're actually detracting away from old Star Wars, and your priority has to be the opposite of that. The magic of the Clone Wars is that Dave created something, particularly in this last arc, that creates its own really great story that also enriches the Star Wars stories that came before. It adds to them, it doesn't detract from them. And that's very similar to what you see in The Mandalorian. The Mandalorian is doing a lot of new stuff. I mean, Baby Yoda, that kind of stuff is new. The Empire's existence past the Battle of Endor, that's new. But they pay very careful attention to all of the older things that are in Star Wars. There's a bunch of nostalgia and complimenting of the old films. It enriches the experience of the older movies. It does not take away from the experience of the older movies. And I totally get them wanting to be creative and do new things, but they should literally have this written on a whiteboard, and every decision that they potentially make for a Star Wars story, they need to run it through the lens of, does this enrich the experience of old Star Wars, or does it potentially detract away? And even if it's like just a little bit of detraction, immediately scratch that idea. Immediately get it out of there. You can't have that at all in Star Wars. And I think that's one of the big reasons that The Mandalorian is so well received, and this last episodes, or these last arc of the Clone Wars, is also so well received. But that's it, folks. Those are my thoughts on the lessons that Lucasfilm and Disney should learn from the Star Wars that they have made that has actually made the majority of fans very happy. They need to reverse engineer some of these lessons and take those lessons and apply them to whatever Star Wars stories they tell in the future. And if they do that, fan base will be right back together again and things will be gravy. But I, of course, want to know what you think about this in the comment section below. And now let's shout out Alex202. Indeed, it was the planet of Selos that they found the clones, including Rex and Wolf, in Star Wars Rebels. And don't worry, spelling doesn't count. So shout out to you, Alex202. And now let's ask another nerd card question before we get out of here. I want to know, what is the name of the Wookiee Padawan from the arc in the Clone Wars where the Padawans create their own lightsabers? That's right, there was a Wookiee Jedi in the Clone Wars. What was the name of that Jedi? Answer that question in the comment section below. If you absolutely need more nerdy content in your life, you can click or tap over there to get lost down a nerdy rabbit hole on some of our content. Like this video if you liked it, or if you want to take your support to the next level, check out our Patreon and join the list of awesome people you see below for some behind the scenes content. As I always say, I hope you're having an awesome and a nerdy day, and I'll see you in the next video.